Hello, I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Jean Kinnan-Mont. And this is Disorder,
A show where we try to order the disorder of our mad world. It's also a show where we increasingly like hosting live events with our partners at RUSI and showcasing the great range of talent that they have on staff. So today it's an honor to be joined by Tom Keating, the director of the Center for Finance and Security at RUSI, a research program he founded in 2014 focusing on the intersection of finance and security. Before that, he was a capital markets banker at JP Morgan for 20 years. And wow, Tom, there has been a lot of disorder where finance and security are intersecting. So who better to unpack this with? Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Yes, the disorder has followed me around over the last 30 years in the financial world, that's for sure.
It seems to be clinging to me as well. Doesn't matter if I'm in Syria or Libya or in DC, I see a lot of disorder. I can't wait to talk sanctions and corruption with you. Certainly, it would appear that corruption has gone from being something that we talk about over there to something which is very endemic over here. So, Tom, given your focus and work, I suggest that we start with a little bit of a discussion, of course, about sanctions and Russia. I've been noticing that as these peace talks, which Trump supposedly could bring to conclusion in 24 hours, as it's going on something like 24,000 hours, and we don't have peace yet between Ukraine and Russia, he always says, you know what, if you don't do this, Ukraine, I'm going to withdraw military support. But when he's going to be angry at the Russians for bombing Kyiv, he threatens them with more sanctions. I'm going to get you guys with more sanctions. So what I want to ask is, given that the war's been going on for more than 2 years, and the US and the EU and the UK have so many sanctions on Russia, is that a credible threat? Can Trump or the EU further sanction Russia to alter their behavior?
Well, it's a good question to ask, because if we haven't thrown the kitchen sink at Russia over the last 3.5 years, what have we been doing? I was struck at the weekend by the European leaders saying, you know, if Putin doesn't come forward and enjoying the ceasefire and so on, there will be massive sanctions. We had someone at RUSI from that world earlier this week, and I said, well, can you define massive, please? Because we've been looking for that definition for the last 3.5 years. Boris Johnson and others promised massive sanctions in early 2022. But I do actually think that there are options available, and I think that partly because we've been very timid over the last 3.5 years. I think we have approached this challenge as a technical one. The Russians have approached defending themselves from sanctions as an existential issue. And so there's been an asymmetry of response. And every time that the West could have pressed forward, you know, either the kind of Hungarians have been spoilers, or, I don't know, the Germans have worried about the Mittelstand businesses losing opportunities in Russia. And then there's the big one, which is, how is Russia financing its economy and its war with oil? How are we getting on in restricting Russia's ability to raise money from its oil? A big fat zero. So I think, you know, the reality is that there are still levers that we can pull. We've been nervous to pull them. And at some point, in a way, as Putin is very good at doing, he's calling our bluff. Okay, you know, you threaten massive sanctions. Come on then, bring it on. And he knows damn well, and you see this in the statements from people like Medvedev and Dmitry Peskov and all the others, you see that, you know, they know that the West is going to worry about its citizens more than it worries about the Ukrainian people when it comes to bringing forward sanctions. So now is the time, frankly. The way I like to think about the Russian economy, if you're old enough, you remember the kind of Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner cartoons, right?
Oh, yeah.
And the Russian economy is over the cliff. But what we need to force Putin to do is to look down and realize that there is nothing under his feet. So there's plenty more left to do, but we have to be brave enough to do it. And that, at the moment, I'm afraid, in Brussels, in London, and who knows what's going on in Washington, D.C., we can talk about that. But that bravery, I'm afraid, has been absent.
We will talk about it, and particularly your use of the word existential, because the Ukrainians are fighting existentially. The Russians are evading sanctions existentially. But it seems, of course, that in the West, the existential nature of this struggle has not been grasped. And that I think has to fall equally on Jake Sullivan and Olaf Scholz, as well as the current crew. I'm wondering about the EU's statement at the weekend that, if Orban or Fico in Slovakia tries to block the tightening of the screws by the EU, that the EU will find ways that cannot be blocked. We've heard about capital controls. What can they do to avoid the Hungarians or Slovakians gumming the works?
So you've given me an opportunity to advertise some work that we do here, because for the last 3.5 years...
That's what I'm here for.
Good. So for the last 3.5 years, we've run a network across the European Union out of our office in Brussels, looking at the implementation. What are EU member states doing to implement sanctions? What are the challenges they face? How are they actually delivering on the decisions that are made in Brussels? Remember, the sanctions decision is made in Brussels, but implementation is on the individual countries. And of course, from the very beginning, there was unity, shoulder to shoulder, all those different cliches, and the sanctions kind of sailed through at 3 o'clock in the morning at the weekend in February, March, April 2022. But as you point out, there are now spoilers there. And if you speak to senior people in Brussels, the one word they hate more than anything now is unanimity, because they can no longer rely on the unanimity without having to kind of negotiate and water down courtesy of the Hungarians or the Slovakians. So where we are at the moment is, the thought process is going on is, what do we do if that unanimity breaks? How do we essentially create synthetic unanimity through, we've heard the use of tariffs, which just need a qualified majority in order to bring forward tariffs. There are the sort of...
And just to be clear, you're talking about EU tariffs on Russia.
EU tariffs on Russia, to kind of block the sale of goods and so on. Then we've got this kind of Plan B mosaic strategy on sanctions, which is to say, okay, let's throw out unanimity in Brussels and make sure that countries are individually introducing regimes which effectively are copy-paste of what's going on at the Brussels level. And in some countries, that's very important. So, for example, the Baltic states, indeed some countries like Poland and some of the Baltic states, have already introduced the capability to sanction Russia on a unilateral basis. There are other important countries that need to get their act together on this, place like Belgium, where the famous central bank assets are held. We do not
You're
want
going to
to see
be talking a lot about Belgium.
Who doesn't want to talk about Belgium?
Good friet.
Good friet, yes, that's true. But the point is that we need to create a mosaic, which means that essentially we can synthetically maintain the economic pressure on Russia. So that, I think, should be a major focus, because June, July is not far away, and that's when we see the next checkpoint. The last thing I would just say is, I think anyone you talk to will credit the Americans for leaning on the Hungarians in January, the last time we had the game of chicken. And the question is, will the Americans be in leaning mode on the Hungarians?
Not exactly.
Well, who knows? Let's see. It depends how, quote-unquote, pissed off Donald Trump is with Vladimir Putin on any given day.
And speaking of Donald Trump, I think this discussion about sanctions and Russia can be clarified by looking at what has just happened today in Syria. The over a decade-long sanctions on Syria U.S. sanctions are in the process of being lifted as part of Donald Trump's famous Gulf tour. And I think, as someone who's lived in Syria for many years, we do need to give the Syrian people a chance. And despite whatever reservations you might have about Ahmed al-Sharaa and reservations about the new regime, sanctions exist as a threat to compel behavioral change. And then if that behavioral change happens, you need to be able to lift them promptly to show, the carrot and the stick. So what would you draw away on this behavior that Trump has done? Because sanctions have sometimes been too sticky in the past.
Yeah, so look, any student of sanctions, or indeed any policymaker of sanctions, should look at the US Treasury's sanctions review under the Biden administration, which came out in late 2021. And one of the key elements of that is, sanctions need to be reversible. They need to be off-ramps. And what Donald Trump has, in a way, demonstrated is this is an off-ramp. Things have changed. The facts have changed on the ground. And so, therefore, we're going to change the facts, i.e. the status of Syria being sanctioned. And nobody could lift sanctions in the way of a showman other than Donald Trump, and that's what he's done. If you look at what he said in announcing that, he wished Syria good luck, and then he said, show us something very special, make the most of the sanctions being reversed. Now, one of the things that we need to bear in mind is this isn't the first time sanctions have been lifted. A very recent example, which really did not work, is the lifting of sanctions on Iran. So just because sanctions are lifted does not mean that the kind of financial floodgates open. But I think an important element of the sanctions lifting that's been announced by Donald Trump is, I hope, the confidence it gives the financial system to support humanitarian organizations that are trying to get funds into the country, who obviously have felt an awful lot of pressure in different countries around the world not to move money because of the risk posed by sanctions. So it's a fantastic case study, and I would love to jump forward 5 years and look back and see, okay, well, what has happened to Syria as a result of the sanctions being lifted? Good luck to them. I agree with Donald Trump. Good luck to them, and we should help them.
I think it is a fantastic case study, and here at Disorder, we like to call balls and strikes and not be too partisan. Whatever you may think of Trump's actions in other domains, this is the kind of thing that his, shall we say, erratic or personal-driven approach may be quite effective at, because he showcased that you can make a deal, and if you comply, there's this carrot at the end of the line. So we could see that as potentially even being useful in Russia negotiations, the potential that he's shown he can, in fact, lift sanctions. Before moving on a little bit, I want to just ask you to give an overview of what you would say the sanctions have done on Russia from 2022 to now in terms of reordering global finance. Because what I'd like to understand is the way in which the rise of new payment systems and essentially new ways of doing business have maybe made the world less interconnected, or sanctions a less powerful tool, the way that people have responded to.
Okay, so let's kind of, I suppose, back up, because one of the criticisms I make of policymakers is I often ask in a room of policymakers on sanctions, put your hand up if you were working on sanctions before February 2022. If you do that in Europe, it's a pretty sparse showing of hands that go up. But the point is, sanctions did not start in February 2022. They've been around for decades, and so we do need to understand history. I mean, the first thing to remember is that in an ideal world, sanctions are agreed at the United Nations Security Council and are therefore globally applicable.
But we don't live in that world.
We don't live in that world, and when Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, you've got a problem. The Security Council is essentially broken. It's broken in multiple ways, but it's clearly broken when it comes to agreeing sanctions. The second thing is that before February 2022, in particular on this side of the Atlantic, sanctions were about sending a message. Like, who was responsible for sanctions policy in different countries? It was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It was a kind of diplomatic tool. We don't like what you're doing. There are some sanctions. End of conversation. And so it was a kind of a messaging and a signaling tool, and a kind of hope that there might be a change in behavior. But there were realistically no consequences. Right? Now that, of course, all changed in 2022 because of the integration of the Russian economy and the European economy in particular. But the other thing in 2022 was that there was a history of sanctions on Russia, i.e. post-2014. And the mistake that was made after 2014 was to, again, issue the sanctions and just not follow through. And Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, made this very explicit point when she went to Kyiv, and I think it was like November 2023, was essentially, we're not going to make the same mistake we made last time, which was to issue the sanctions and then think we're done. But of course, the Russians shapeshift. The sanctions are, of value for a nanosecond, and they've reorganized themselves. The FSB have built new trading relations, and off you go again. So, sanctions were kind of subordinate to other priorities in that post-2014 period. And the result is that when Boris Johnson and others were threatening massive sanctions back in late 2021, early 2022, Vladimir Putin would have been forgiven for going, yeah, whatever, I've heard it all before. And by the way, we've been preparing ourselves for this moment anyway, and we've reduced external borrowing and yada, yada, yada. We built a fortress economy. So, I think a lot has changed in the way that we think about sanctions. You look at the staffing just on the street outside RUSI, on Wall Street. It's not Wall Street outside RUSI, it's Whitehall, but you know what I mean. The Foreign Office and the Treasury have massively increased the number of people that they've got working on this. The same The same on the continent. But what has also happened is that others have reacted. You can't issue sanctions and not expect reaction. So in the trips that we have the opportunity to do to places like South Africa or Central Asia or so on, people are going, okay, we need to rewire the way we trade. We need to rewire the way we conduct our financial activities, because sanctions once issued, even if they're lifted, sanctions once issued are not forgotten. So there has been, to use your phrase, a reordering of trade and finance as a result of our sanctions. And we need to recognize that, and we need to adapt accordingly.
So, Tom, firstly, waffles. Waffles are another good thing from Belgium.
Oh, from Belgium, yes.
Also
yes.
Chocolate, but we should try and think of some things that are not food-related, just because I haven't had dinner yet. Secondly, I wonder, if we're going to see sanctions regimes becoming more fragmented with the kind of international political differences that we see now, or is it really all in the hands of the US? So I'm thinking of two examples, right? One is with Iran. We saw a period where Europe wanted to have a different policy than the US on Iran sanctions because they stayed in the nuclear deal, but they discovered that they could do very little with US secondary sanctions. Going forward, what happens if there is a US-Russia agreement? Trump thinks it's a good idea to lift sanctions on Russia. Can Europe go it alone? Would they even want to go it alone? I spoke to one former French official who just said, I think Trump's going to force Europe to lift sanctions too. But if he didn't, what can Europe achieve if it's acting on sanctions independently of the US?
So let's kind of unpack the thesis, first of all, because I think one really important thing to remember is that one of the things that the US can do, short of lifting sanctions, is to issue more licenses. And not to get technical, but you might remember there was a big hue and cry a few weeks ago when, his name escapes me, but chap who's sanctioned went to Washington, D.C., and everyone was like, what's going on? The guy's traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with the White House. Well, he was given a license, as I understand it, to be able to travel there for a week, and then the license was revoked. So I think what one can expect, and what I've heard from people in Washington, is that there are essentially kind of two teams of people working in Washington, D.C. You've got those who are thinking of licenses, not lifting of sanctions, but licenses that can be offered as kind of little
small
bonbons.
carrots.
Yeah. And then those are thinking, okay, I'm going to design the big hammer if the president calls for more pressure on Russia. So I think the Americans have more flexibility to kind of use the accelerator and the brake than certainly the Europeans have. That's the first point. In terms of this kind of idea of kind of coalitions of sanctions, coalitions of the willing, which is a popular phrase at the moment. In reality, sanctions work best when there's unity in application. And as soon as you don't have unity in application, you have loopholes and gaps and all the rest of it. And that's why the sanctions, I would argue, have been reasonably effective on Russia over the last 3.5 years, because the countries, with some exceptions that matter, have been unified in their approach. And so what I suppose I'm hoping is that this infrastructure that has been built over the last 3.5 years, all these people working on sanctions in Brussels and in European Union member states and up and down Whitehall in London, that there is the capacity to kind of work together to create, again, this kind of mosaic effect in implementing sanctions. At the end of the day, the Americans don't have that much economic skin in the game when it comes to sanctions on Russia. What they have is the dollar and the kind of the universality of the use of the dollar, the global financial system. But in reality, the economic pressure, like where does the oil flow? It flows through the Baltic Sea. Okay, well, that's European. It flows through the Danish Straits. It flows through the English Channel. It flows through the Straits of Gibraltar. Yes, and then it goes to India and China. But we have more control, I think, in Europe than we have so far exerted. And I would argue that is, if the Americans were to take their toys home and to decide that they want to focus on other things, and even start lifting sanctions on Russia, which I kind of feel is unlikely, then Europe is the biggest trading bloc in the world. Europe seems surprisingly timid in the way it acts. It spent most of its sanctions history resisting, American secondary sanctions, blocking statute this, blah, 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 blah. I mean, I would like to see the European Union kind of step up. And so if the Americans decide to go home, playing field's open for Europe to demonstrate what it can do.
So what's your advice to Europe on how to use sanctions in a way that actually works? Because one critique of sanctions is sometimes they're something a government does when it doesn't really know what else to do and it doesn't want to do a war. And, Jason, you mentioned sanctions being about behaviour change, which is great in theory, but we also seem to see lots of examples where that doesn't happen. And it seems to be punitive and kind of unchanging. So, how do you get sanctions to work, not just to squeeze an economy and make people's lives difficult, but to achieve something positive politically?
So if the director of the UK Sanctions Directorate were here, he would say, remember, sanctions are but a tool in the foreign policy toolbox. I think it is important because if you think that sanctions are going to be a kind of Doctor Who sonic screwdriver and fix every and all problem, then you're going to be sorely disappointed. And I think, frankly, that a lot of political leaders in February 2022 thought that and were thus disappointed by the impact sanctions had in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion. So I think you have to look at this as an important tool in the diplomatic toolbox. And so if you talk to the community that are kind of going out there and trying to ensure that countries comply with sanctions, particularly those that are on the kind of fringes of the EU, kind of former Soviet states, they're diplomats on the whole. They're diplomats because they're essentially trying to get a country to do something that it doesn't have to do. It's not the legal obligation of, Armenia or Georgia or South Africa or these kinds of places to implement these sanctions. So what those countries are looking for is something in return. I mean, it's a trade. Let's get all Donald Trump, right? It's transactional. And I think what the EU in a way has failed to do is to offer the other side of that trade. We want you to restrict the trade in critical high priority items with Russia, the electronic goods and so on that it needs for its battlefield weapons. But at the same time, we're prepared to give you a bit more access to the European Union market. So I would like to see sanctions used much more as a kind of as a tool of negotiation than just simply the hammer coming down.
So we're talking about sanctions compelling behavioral change. I want to mention one of the examples where they really did work. And this is in response to the Lockerbie bombing. The most comprehensive UN sanctions in history were imposed on Libya from 1992 to 1999. And yes, of course, the Libyan people saw their standard of living decreased and their ability to travel essentially entirely revoked. But the regime stopped funding terror. That was the goal of those sanctions. And the goal was to get the Libyan regime to say, we will compensate the victims of Lockerbie. And it did that at Camp Zeist, and it did it in the negotiations in Switzerland with Martin Indyk and Sir Mark Allen. And I think that that is a very illustrative parallel, because if we look at the difference between the blanket Libya sanctions as opposed to the oil for food program in Iraq, you can see what is required and what works and what doesn't. The Libya sanctions worked because they were completely blanket. All the surrounding states imposed them until they didn't. And in Iraq, of course, people were willing to smuggle things in and out, and we didn't have a unified world community. And then, in the Libyan case, there was a clear out. If you admit that you did Lockerbie, or you're willing to not admit it, but pay more than $2 billion in compensation to the victims of it, the sanctions will be lifted and then the détente can start. So I just tossed that out as two parallels. But maybe we can briefly come away from sanctions to the US, Russia, Ukraine negotiations. Trump has off and on threatened the Ukrainians. We won't give you these military items. We're not going to do air defense. We're not going to give you the intelligence. And people have died when that has been withdrawn. And then he gives it back. But on the financial bit, he said, I really want to see that we're going to get this minerals deal. And in theory, the US-Ukraine mineral deal. And earlier this week, I was speaking with Mark McNamee of the Ukraine Business News Network. And he surprised me live on air when he said, oh my God, this is a seminal deal. It has real political significance, and it's going to hook Trump and America to be committed to Ukrainian territorial integrity. Now, I don't believe that, but I was fascinated to hear a very pro-Ukrainian person living on the ground in Kyiv who said that. Now, oppositely, on my last live show, we were at the Frontline Club at the end of March, and we were with Bill Browder and Stephanie Baker, two extreme experts on sanctions on Russia. And what did they say? They said the minerals deal is a complete joke. There are barely any critical minerals. No one is going to make any money from this. It won't change behavior one iota. If they sign it, it's merely a PR exercise. So here I have the great expert of RUSI on sanctions. Who beeth right? Who beeth wrong?
Well, far be it from me to have a fight with Sir William Browder. But look, I think that's interesting because you referred to at the end of March and then you referred to earlier this week. And to some extent, the shape of the deal has changed.
But the deal has only weakened in all the things that it has to do.
It's only weakened, but it's moved in the direction of Ukraine, right? I mean, it's less, they're giving away perhaps less than they were. Look, the bottom line is that you can see Donald Trump's desire for a deal coming a mile away, right? When I was as an investment banker, we always used to have, know your client, right? I don't mean know your client in terms of due diligence and so on, but know what they want. So don't rock up there and try and sell an Eskimo a fridge, right? Because you're not going to succeed, even if you're the fridge salesman person. You've got to find a way of making that transaction work. And I think with Donald Trump, at the end of the day, I actually think the Ukrainians, it looks to me as though they've been quite smart. Right, you had that complete implosion in the Oval Office back in February. The deal was meant to be signed then. I don't think that deal sounded very good for the Ukrainians at all. So the process has been drawn out, and possibly, and I'm speculating, but possibly between the front line at the end of March and earlier this week in the middle of May, the deal perhaps looks better for Ukraine, a deal that works for them. Importantly, it keeps the Americans and Donald Trump kind of on the hook. The deal's been signed, so Donald Trump will want to make that deal actually look like something over the next 4 years. So I take my hat off to the Ukrainians. They seem to have done something here which has kept the Americans involved without actually receiving a heap of criticism for giving away the crown jewels. And if it takes 10 years to get the stuff out of the ground or whatever it might be, well, that's on the Americans in a way. So I'm pretty happy. I mean, what does it mean in Brussels? I would have thought again they must be pretty happy because it keeps the Americans interested.
So what's your view, Tom, on the whole debate about seizing Russian assets that are in Europe? I mean, we can see the temptation and the argument for it, but could that have some unintended consequences? Could it deter people from putting their assets in Europe in the future if they think they might be bad guys who would be vulnerable to assets being seized?
Yeah, so I think the first thing you have to say whenever you talk about Russian assets is that there are two different categories of assets. Here we're talking about the central bank assets, the reserves of the Russian Federation that were held by the central bank, not the oligarch assets, which is a topic which MPs tend to get foaming at the mouth about. So let's just put those to one side. When it comes to the central bank assets, just to recap for everybody, very early after the full-scale invasion, sanctions were passed by the G7 to immobilize Russia's central bank foreign reserves that were held outside Russia, primarily in an organization which has been thrust into the spotlight very uncomfortably, called Euroclear, which is based in Belgium. Important fact.
There we
Belgium's
go.
back. So what has now happened is people said, okay, there is, pick a number, $300 billion of these assets that have been immobilized. I must say that was probably the most effective sanction brought forward by the G7 over the last 3.5 years.
The most effective thing that they've done in the entire war.
That was definitely not expected by the Kremlin. So they're sitting there and people are going, okay, so what can we do with those? Tragedy, enter the lawyers who basically start explaining why there's nothing you can do with these assets. They're sovereign immunity, this, blah, 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 you can't take them away. But there are some smart lawyers out there. And so where we've got to now is I think there's generally an accepted belief that there is a concept called countermeasures. I'm not going to get technical, but there's a concept called countermeasures. It basically means that in order to coerce a country to do something, you can do something in return. So the idea here is that you would basically take those assets, but critically, a countermeasure has to be reversible. So a bit like sanctions, if Russia were to meet whatever is required of them in order to have those assets given back to them, you have to be able to give the assets back. What that means is you cannot take them away and spend them on rebuilding in Ukraine. You have to be able to return them. Now, in the meantime, the G7 has come up with a way of providing some funds based on the central bank assets. I won't get into the complexities of accelerated loans, blah, blah, blah. But the point is that some funds have been provided on the basis of those assets. But it was, again, a fudge. It was a kind of lowest common denominator solution. And actually, there are bigger bangs for our buck that we can get out of this situation if we're smart.
And I want to differentiate your view from that of Bill Browder. He wants to simply seize the assets, not as countermeasure. It's something that he and I have spoken about reasonably frequently. And I guess I'm quite hardcore on this. I wrote an article in USA Today the very week that Navalny was killed. It's about a year ago now, maybe a little bit over a year ago. And I advocated for pretty much all the G7 countries to pass Navalny acts and their legislators and seize the assets. And it wouldn't be a countermeasures, it wouldn't be a legal fudge, it would be the G7 countries simply doing a kind of financial war that their legislatures would give them the ability to do.
So just there's obviously there is a more kind of a hawkish view, which you've outlined. But there's a second part to Jane's question, which is, but what are the unintended consequences? And the unintended consequences argument, I think, was in the ascendancy for much of the last 3.5 years. And the main unintended consequence, not forgetting the legal stuff for a second, is that there was, about a year ago, some kind of whispering campaign reported involving places like Saudi Arabia that were saying, well, gosh, if you touch those central bank assets, those euro-denominated central bank assets, we don't know if we can trust the euro anymore, blah, blah, blah. And that tapped right into the PTSD that those who are responsible for stewarding the Eurozone have after the European sovereign debt crisis of 10 or so years ago, right? So there's a big concern in the Eurozone that we don't want to do anything that increases or puts mistrust on the euro, because we've been there before and that was ugly. So no wonder kind of Christine Lagarde has said some quite cautious, indeed really quite, I think, weak things about leaning into this challenge over the last few years. But again, back to the beginning of the conversation, the Hungary moment is coming up. And so we better come up with a solution if we don't want to see those assets fly should Hungary not renew sanctions in later this summer.
But you mentioned the Saudis and their concerns, and they have a point. Wouldn't a country like that potentially consider itself vulnerable if there are Navalny acts? Why not a Jamal Khashoggi act or a 9/11 act? Obviously, they haven't gone and invaded in a Ukraine-style invasion. They did get stuck into Yemen to try to reverse the Houthi coup there. So you can see why some other countries that have money that's meaningful in our financial systems might have that kind of whispering campaign to say, don't go down this route.
Look, I think that's true, but I think that's also why we have to make sure we're following international law, which is why I kind of disagree with the take it all now and just put it to work for the Ukrainians, because then I think you do start to cross a line which opens you up to this criticism. But essentially, what you're saying by using countermeasures is, unless you are planning on invading your neighbour in an illegal war, then your assets are perfectly safe with us. So I think it's a defensible position. I just think again, to be honest, almost certainly the Russians managed to get the Saudis to say something. I don't know, I'm speculating. But the point is, the Russians have played the kind of international diplomacy game far, far better than the G7 on this. I mean, you look at the way Lavrov was kind of almost circling Africa in the early days of the full-scale invasion, before any Western leaders had gone to talk to those countries about the food security issues they were facing because of the risk to grain supplies, the energy price shocks that they were facing because of the rise in oil price. We simply weren't. And I had a dispute with a former minister on Twitter on this. We were not prepared, beyond perhaps having decided the initial packages, we weren't prepared for dealing with the consequences of what we were rolling out.
After the break, we discussed, do markets really work? Let's talk about if the global enduring disorder makes markets not work. I have actually been surprisingly optimistic in the last 2 months about the way in which the markets have shown themselves able to hold governments to account. You may even agree with this statement that the bond market is that thing which may save American democracy, because we've seen that Trump is willing to disregard the Supreme Court. He's willing to run roughshod over the legislature, but he won't disregard if the spread between the short-term and long-term yield on a T-bill is changing. Then he backs off immediately because the markets are still, to some extent, working, particularly this one aspect that I've pointed out. And in fact, sitting here as we are in Whitehall, I think it's important of saying that the markets have quite a track record since we've gotten into the enduring disorder over these last 15 years in working. We may all recall Liz Truss's famous mini budget, sometimes called the quasi-Kwarteng mini budget.
Or the kamikaze budget. That was my favorite.
Or the kamikaze mini budget. And what made it kamikaze was that the markets and their change caused political leaders to instantly back down, and in this case also get booted out by the 1922 committee. So do the markets work? And am I overly optimistic when I think that some of the extreme danger that we saw after Liberation Day, we might actually be liberated from that danger by the market's ability to push back?
Well, I think that's certainly evidence to suggest that that is the case. You're going to have to allow me to tell a short story.
I would love you to tell a short story.
Good. Well, when I first joined JP Morgan, believe it or not, I was sent with a bunch of other people for an all-expenses 6-month training program on Wall Street in 1994 or whenever it was. And we had a bond math teacher at the time. And he used to chant regularly, life's a stream of cash flows, right? And I would go one step further, as life is a stream of cash flows, and today is defined by the present value of those future cash flows. Now, this is getting into...
Wow, this is a great bon mot.
This is getting into...
I'm going to be quoting this every day.
Yeah. So next stop the LSE. But the point is that if you make the markets nervous, then as you point out, you see yields rise, so borrowing rates rise, and that doesn't just affect the future, it affects today, because the present value, blah, 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 blah. And so essentially, if the markets sit there and go, okay, this guy/gal is a lunatic, it's going to have the following impact over the next 5 years. We work out what the present value of that lunacy is, and in the case of the Truss government, it became known as the moron premium, and we basically price that into the cost of borrowing today. And at that point, companies go, this is crazy, or individuals, think about your mortgage. It was talked about a lot at the time with the Liz Truss mini budget. So the markets have a very instantaneous way of reacting to expectations of the future. And if those expectations are dire, that means that today becomes dire.
But why do we then not see the markets doing more to tackle climate change? Is it just too far off or too apparently uncertain despite the scientific consensus? I'm inspired partly by the fact that I'm incredibly slowly reading this book called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, which is really creative but really hard to read because the plot is all about innovative financial instruments tackling climate change, which doesn't really make for a thriller-type plot.
I find that very thrilling.
But it is quite interesting. And why does it not happen automatically that markets would think, the way these economies are going, they are going to kind of burn up the earth in a couple of decades, and maybe that should be factored into present value in some way?
It's a good question. I think that there is a horizon, and I think the markets look to the horizon. I'm not sure whether they actually look over the horizon. And at some point, the kind of cone of uncertainty becomes so enormous that that's very hard to price. Look, it's 10 years since I left JP Morgan, and back at that time, people were thinking about sort of how to finance green innovation and all that sort of stuff. No one was sitting there going, okay, well, we're going to issue 1,000-year. I mean, I worked on a transaction when I worked on Wall Street. I worked on a transaction for a 1,000-year bond, right? 1,000-year bond. I think we can be fairly sure that the climate change will have an impact over the next 1,000 years. But I don't think that bond is trading on climate change expectations. It's trading on maybe the next 20, 30 years of expectations. So I don't think we've got to the point yet where the markets can look over the horizon and the present. The other thing, by the way, of course, is you've really started me now. The price value of a basis point, blah, blah, blah. I mean, a 1% interest rate move in 1,000 years is worth virtually nothing today, right? So if you think the world's going to blow up in 1,000 years, I don't care today. If you think the world's going to blow up in the next 10 years, boy, I do care today.
And this gets at a really core issue of the enduring disorder and something that we've tried to drill down to on the podcast. Our coordination mechanisms are very bad at addressing and pricing in longer-term challenges. They may be reasonably good at medium or short to medium-term challenges. And you've explained why, which is that some changes now change an economic outlook in 10, 20 years a tremendous amount, whereas maybe things over the horizon and how they filter back, there isn't so much of a direct connection there. And I think we need non-market mechanisms and something that we seem to be woefully lacking these days called political leadership and moral courage to deal with these longer-term challenges. So I guess then that brings us to the third segment. We've done sanctions and we've done markets. Let's talk tariffs. You cannot speak of the intersection between finance and security today without mentioning the Donald's favorite word in the English language, the word that he seems to not realize comes directly from Arabic, tariff. So, Tom, what are tariffs? We know that they don't work. Smoot Hawley didn't work. Why does Donald Trump think that tariffs work? What does he think they are? Does he have some vision of like Japanese or Korean import substitution from the 1950s? What is he not getting?
So obviously tariffs have always had an air of controversy, sort of helping advance trade protectionism. But I think for Donald Trump, he has two very specific beliefs. The first one is that they are kind of a tool of coercion and punishment. I mean, look at his early announcement on tariffs. They were about targeting countries that he believed were the source of the fentanyl crisis that America faces. And then secondly, to make money, right? To make money. He has this belief that, you know, the money's pouring in, the billions are pouring in. And in that regard, sort of try and address trade deficits. And this is not my example, but I'm going to use it anyway. I think he is completely misunderstands the nature of trade deficits. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have a trade deficit with somebody.
In fact, when you're very wealthy and you can buy lots of stuff, you have a trade deficit.
Yeah, and the example that is often given is, you have a trade deficit with your hairdresser, right? You pay your hairdresser for a service.
I just got it done yesterday.
There you go, right? You have a deficit.
And it shows.
Thank you.
But now you need to put a tariff on your hairdresser because your hairdresser, you have a deficit in favor of your hairdresser. Well,
Mark, if you're listening, I'm not going to. Don't worry.
So, I mean, there is this kind of crazy notion that this is how you're going to address kind of trade deficits and all the rest of it. So there is a kind of a nonsense. But what, again, as with sanctions, and we talked about earlier on, what tariffs are doing is basically rewiring the global economy. Businesses make decisions, and businesses make decisions very quickly because they want certainty. So, I think the US should not be surprised, or Donald Trump should not be surprised that, if he looks back in a few years' time, things have moved away from them. Things will move away from them because people are going to say, well, I want the certainty of trade. And if it means I have to trade with country A, B, and C instead of trading with the United States, that's where I'm going to go. So I think it's an entirely destructive thing to do. But if you look at his objectives of tariffs, then perhaps, we just have different views of how tariffs should be used.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I found so fascinating but also mind-boggling, and excuse me if I go off on a mini rant on this, but it was seeing that clip of Donald Trump basically saying, you kids have too many toys. And, if you've got a little girl and your little girl has like 35 dolls, just tell her she should have 2. And I thought, this is brilliant. As a mum of 2 girls, they do have too many toys.
But I want to tell Donald, if you have 27 golden toilet bowls, just have only 2.
Or your wife's shoes, etc. But I mean, my kids, if they go to America, they go absolutely wild on toys because the toy expectations in America are the best. I don't know if people know American Girl dolls. They cost about $100 a doll, but that is just the beginning because then you're on this spiral that your dolls will have dolls. The dolls have more accessories and clothes and shoes than I have. And if you go on kids' YouTube, one of the big things you see is families opening toys, unboxing. So the joy is opening the toy. Once you've got it, it's rubbish, right? You need more. It's like a kind of toy fentanyl, right? So I sort of thought, Donald Trump is talking sense. I should show this to my kids at Christmas. But why is this coming? Why is this coming from a
Did you
Republican?
know that you don't need tariffs to not buy your kids more dolls?
I've got to tell the kids this. Maybe my calculations are wrong. But you think...
I know another way, actually, to have the kids have less dolls. We could wreck the entire global economy.
Yes.
Have a depression worse than the Great Depression, and then there'll be no production. We'll go back to the Stone Age, and there'll be no dolls.
Honestly, it might
That
be
seems like a
easier.
very rational way to get to that
To
goal.
me, it seems easier than saying no to my kids on toys. I'm already saying no on having a cat and a dog, and it's all too difficult. But anyway, quite seriously, you can imagine a lot of very different politicians making this argument, again, going to climate change, sustainability. We have too much stuff. We should stop gearing the global economy towards the unnecessary consumerism and the sort of private
Of course, and
consumption.
that's a question of coordination. We want to have optimal coordination.
So, is it a broader trend against globalization and a reorientation of what the global economy is going to look like, what the priorities are? So it's less driven by the Western consumer or the emerging middle classes from global South countries that want to be just like the Western consumer.
Globalization, in a way, peak globalization has passed, and it's passed for lots of different reasons that we talked about already.
When did it peak?
Well, I'm not quite sure if we know yet, to be honest.
There's an argument that globalization peaked in 1913, that if you think of the way in which the gold standard before World War I allowed the movement of money and goods, that was actually a deeper kind of globalization than we got even in the 1990s.
But how inclusive was that globalization, or DEI on you? But so I would argue that the kind of globalization peaked at some point over the last, say, 10, 15 years, right? And what we have failed to do, and in a way you kind of see this in an awful lot of the way that elections and so on have turned out in recent years, and referendums in this country and all the rest of it, is that those sitting at the centre are very, very bad at understanding what is going on out there, right? I have a friend who worked for a hedge fund back at the time of the Brexit referendum, and I saw him not that long before the referendum, and he's, I'm going off to do a tour of the regions, and he went to all the places out and about the UK, and I saw him not that long after the referendum result came in, and he said, it was blindingly obvious the way people were going to vote. I couldn't go to a pub or whatever it might be in, I don't know, Lincolnshire or wherever it was, and not hear a plurality of voices that were going to vote out. So I think the real risk we have is that we're so, places like the IMF and the World Bank, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary in the US, has been going on about this recently. I think that we're so focused on our sort of little mission we don't realize that the world is changing around us, and we need to adapt accordingly to ensure that we are inclusive. And, the G7 might be the 7 biggest economies in the world, but you know what? We're not necessarily driving the agenda anymore. China, India, Brazil, the BRICS.
Because it isn't the 7th largest economy
No,
in the
it's
world.
not.
Because
It's a
the
misnomer.
Chinese are number
Yeah,
2.
it's a misnomer. So I think, and in a way, looking forward, this is one of the things that we need to grasp is how do we ensure that these institutions that have been a critical element of financial security around the world for decades of globalization remain relevant? Because otherwise they're just going to get passed on the outside by new institutions that those that control the current institutions are left out of.
Join us after the break as we order the disorder and turn to the live audience for listener questions. At the Disorder Pod, Tom, we love me some solutions. So you've mentioned the UN and the G7 and the IMF in disparaging terms heretofore tonight. And I have to say, I'm not that shocked because most of the days when you're reading the news, you find out about how these institutions don't work anymore. So what I want to ask you is, of the current crop of institutions that we have, what is the potential ordering role that they can play as currently constituted?
Well, I think they need to get back to basics, essentially. So what was their role? How was their role originally defined? That needs to be updated to deal with the kind of global economies that we have now, both the World Bank and the IMF, and focus on essentially using the tools that they have to ensure that the economies of countries around the world are benefiting, to the same extent as those that we sit in. I think they've lost sight of their mission. So I really encourage people to have a look at the speech that Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, made at the IIF during the World Bank spring meetings, because I thought it was a very kind of good articulation of the mission creep that these organizations have undertaken, and a very powerful, I think, call to get back to basics and essentially stick to your knitting.
How about the World Trade Organization? They seem almost silent. Is that an organization that can still effectively function, even if it means it needs to tell off the US?
Again, what an organization like the World Trade Organization has no credibility if it is not prepared to kind of stand up to the likes of the United States. And whereas there may have been no consequences to not taking on that role 20 years ago, there now are consequences because there are bigger players in the playground than just the school bully. And I think that's where these organizations have lost sight of, if you like, they're constantly looking, okay, what does Washington have to say? But actually there's a whole bunch of other people who are now relevant in a way that they weren't economically relevant 30 years ago.
Well, not everyone is larger than the school bully, but sometimes people are kinder and wiser and more ordering. Tell us, what role can Britain play in trying to be a top table orderer, a convener, a cajoler, an orderer?
So I'm going to stick to the question of sort of finance, given that's the focus of our program at the Centre for Finance and Security at RUSI. Look, when it comes to finance, the UK represents the best and the worst, right? The UK is often criticised for being part of the problem, its overseas territories, the kind of network of money laundering centres that it curates around the world. And that clearly is a problem, and it's something when we go travelling. I mean, if you work for RUSI, one of the worst things about working for RUSI is you have Whitehall on your business card. So you rock up to a meeting anywhere in the world, and this happened to me in Pakistan, and the chap looked at me and said, "Sir, you must know that we don't have a lot of don't have a lot of respect for people with Whitehall on their business card here here in Islamabad." And so I think we regularly hear that yes, your country is where the dirty assets or the stolen assets from our country come. What are you doing about returning those to us? So I think there are some sort of parochial issues like that the UK needs to sort out. I think we'd hope that the Labour government would pick up the challenge and run with it. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, has a kind of illicit finance campaign. It remains to be seen what that actually does. But clearly, for a number of years, the previous government dropped the ball. In fact, I'm wont to say that the person who's done the most for moving the UK forward on combating its role as a kind of global centre for illicit finance was actually Vladimir Putin, because by invading Ukraine, it forced the government to bring forward all sorts of legislation that had been waiting in the wings. So I think dealing with that, although it sounds kind of technical, it matters because it's an area where the UK loses and therefore can gain respect. On the sanctions field in Europe, someone in Brussels said to me, look, Tom, the only file in Brussels where you don't feel Brexit is the sanctions file, because I think the UK and the EU have worked very closely together on that. I think the UK government should be congratulated for kind of the leadership that has demonstrated on that. But that needs to go further, and it might become an even more important position of leadership if the Americans, as we were talking about before, go home. And the last thing I would point to is to go back to something else that we talked about earlier on, is that there is nowhere better on the planet, for good or worse, at financial engineering than the City of London. And I say that as someone who used to do that sort of thing. But there is nowhere better. And I would like to see the UK take leadership on this question of the Russian central bank assets, because the smart people in this town who can figure this out and should be allowed to do so.
Excellent. That's an actual solution.
That's super interesting. I wondered if you've got anything to add on how technologies might be leveraged for some of these issues. I don't know too much about how blockchain actually functions, but is that something that could make it much easier to crack down on illicit finance if you can trace transactions and make it harder to launder money?
So I'm going to be a dinosaur on this, which is that there's a lot of Kool-Aid being drunk, I think, on this kind of on this topic. So the bottom line is what we need is transparency, and whatever gives us transparency of cash flows and of financial flows, whatever gives us transparency, we should embrace, because that is the way we deal with the challenge of illicit finance. Whether that's blockchain, open registries to see who owns what company, all that kind of stuff. But what I fear sometimes is that the whiz-bang technology solution is seen as the new great thing, and therefore it's going to solve all our problems, and actually it doesn't. It just compounds them. I mean, what has cryptocurrency done, which is based obviously on the blockchain? What has that done? That's compounded our challenges of trying to deal with the illicit finance problem, whatever the crypto bros might say. So
you're in a very safe audience here, because at Disorder, literally every expert on finance and kleptocracy that we have had on, from Tina Pralick to Bill Browder to Stephanie Baker, says the answer is transparency. It's the antiseptic light of day which will clean out the cobwebs, and I couldn't agree more.
So because it's consistent for me to disagree with Bill during this, I agree that transparency is important, but it's also the data you have underlying that transparency, right? So, for example, the UK company registry was one of the first to be transparent after the anti-corruption summit in London in 2016 under David Cameron. And what the transparency did was reveal garbage, and it revealed a system that didn't work. Now, that system is now being fixed the best part of 10 years later. So I think transparent garbage is not a lot of help. So I would argue that actually if you have untransparent but good data, that could be actually a better option. The best option is transparent, good data. So I think it is important to remember that it is the data that matters, not just the transparency
We
per
will
se.
have an opportunity right now to disagree agreeably. I think it's the transparency that pushes you forward, because if you look at a place like Libya, where no one knows how money gets from the central bank to the Eastern commercial banks, what is the bad debt that sits in the Eastern commercial banks. Yes, all the data is bad, but if it would be transparent, it would be exposed, and the Libyan people would call every sort of corruption to account. So you need the initial transparency to have the light of day to shine in, and then this will build the political will to root out corrupt actors, to change the systems, to, particularly in the Libyan case, we haven't even talked about subsidies. I was thinking of having a fourth category, and that would be subsidies. And I think you need transparency to point out how subsidies in many places in the world, allow money to be stolen.
So to be very clear, I'm not against transparency, but you have to act on what that transparency reveals.
Yes, but people will act. If they understand and it is shown and it is accessible where every pence goes from the central bank of Libya outward, the Libyan people will begin to act. And I think that that's the case, that if we understood, for example, who is the beneficial owner of so much of property in the United Kingdom, or who is the beneficial owner of a lot of crypto, there will then instantly be the political will for that action.
The UK government did not act on what Transparency at Companies House revealed for nearly 10 years, despite the calls for them to do that. It's not like people weren't noticing it. So I agree. People don't like what they see and they call for action. The question is whether that action occurs, I think.
So we always wrap up by asking, if you were king for a day, what international governance institution would you create to promote an orderly way out of our current mess? What would it do? Who would be in it? And how would it actually compel compliance to its directives, Tom?
I'm going to go back to something I said earlier on, and it's going to allow me to talk about another trip that we did recently, which was to Romania. And one of the reasons for going was to look at the way money had influenced the election, presidential election, which they terminated or suspended late last year, and it's just in the process of being rerun now. And the reason I mention that is because the one thing which sticks in my mind from that trip was when an MP said to us, if my electorate knew how much money is wasted by the European Commission, how many jobs there are for life, how many people there are sitting around doing things which might have been relevant 10, 15, 20 years ago and are still clipping the coupon every month. They would want out of the European Union tomorrow. And I don't just apply that to the European Union, I apply that to many of these international organizations. So actually, and there is a scintilla of sense in much of what Donald Trump does and what he's done. But actually, I think what I would like to see is, when it comes to international institutions, a Doge that basically looks at all these organizations and says, what are you trying to achieve? And to the extent that you are not achieving it, we're going to change it. And to the extent we have too many people living off tax-free salaries and all the rest of it, we're going to get rid of them. So that's what I want to do, because this is why I think we face the kind of democratic challenges we face, is that people simply don't trust the institutions that they are relying on to make their lives better, to make their economies function effectively. And we need to kind of clean the Augean stables, is my view. And somebody needs to be brave enough to do that in these international institutions. So that's my answer.
Well, you're a braver man than me, and I need to point out that is not an endorsed by disorder solution, because it is the last thing I could possibly want would be to take the absurdity and inefficiencies of something like the Doge International.
If it was what it says it is.
Correct.
And it's not run by someone that's got their own government contracts and vested interests and all of that stuff. But I was actually going to pick up on Doge as a kind of counter argument to your point about transparency, because I think people don't have time to look at all the evidence. And one thing Doge has done quite effectively is pretend to be revealing loads of data that was already published. So they'll say, look, we found this stuff. And everyone goes, oh, you found this stuff, but it was available on the government websites previously. And it does show there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on with what they're actually doing. But
that's an understatement and a half.
If it was real, maybe it could be something good.
So I want to tell one last story just to make sure that people don't think that I'm some kind of Elon Musk acolyte here. So
look, we'll get good pickup on Twitter.
When I was at JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon made a senior staffing decision. I won't go into the details of it, but he made a senior staffing decision that was cataclysmically unpopular on this side of the Atlantic. And it was very interesting. He realized that he made a huge mistake. And he flew to London. He got us all into the basement. I can't remember where it was. But anyway, basically pretty much locked the door in true JP Morgan himself fashion and said, look, I'm not going to leave this room until all questions are answered. But he said, the interesting thing he said that I remember him saying was words to the effect of, I give myself an A for the decision I took, and this is the reason I took the decision I gave, but I give myself an E for execution. I give myself an E, a fail for execution, because I did not execute this in the right way. And I think there's kind of an element to what we've been talking about here of that. Some of the ideas, I think I personally can get behind, but boy is the execution cack-handed.
We are going to save the fantastic question and answers. We had like more than 30 of them because we locked the doors and we wouldn't let the live audience out until they all asked questions. We're going to save those great questions and answers for paid members to the Substack. Ergo, please follow the link in the show notes. Join the Substack, upgrade to being a paid member, and you will get that amazing content, and you can listen to it on your phone or on your computer. Woo! Now we're going to skip ahead to the last question, which really elicited a summing up of the intersection between finance and security and disorder. And then Jane and Tom and I tell our takeaways and closing stories.
Hi, Tony Royce, military background veteran. If we accept, and I'm assuming, generally speaking, we do, it's maybe incorrect, that the rules-based international system is dead, or at least Putin has proven you can work your way around it for at least 3.5 years regarding its financial coercion aspect. At what point or what huge event might bring real change? I recall talk of the 1937 moment 3 years ago, and we're still clearly not there, where Western politicians will start to talk to their electorates about the West being somewhat less decadent and moving back to a stage where in the Cold War we were spending 6, 7, 8, 9% of GDP on defence. Is that event actually possible? Because it doesn't seem to have happened yet. They just bleat about change.
Maybe this is such a great question. If you don't mind, I will allow it to be our last point here. I'll make some comments. I'll hear from Jane and then Tom, and then I'd like us each to give a parting thought or story to conclude. 1937 moment. Okay. I certainly agree it needs to get worse before it gets better. And I think that moment of we're going to have to not only belt tighten, but change the way we do politics and expenditures and the role between government and the private sector and the voter is needed, but that it's going to come not from leadership, but from the electorate. In other words, you talked about a top-down where Ursula von der Leyen strides in, or the Finnish prime minister, and says, you know what? We're scrod. We're going to need to spend 10% on defense and 5% on solar panels because, your kids are going to have to wear irradiation suits if we don't. That could happen, but I see it's going to be bottom up. People are going to be so fed up with all the implications of these neo-populist politicians, not only Trump, but Orban and Le Pen and all the disorder that's going around, that there will be a social movement. I could call it, for example, protest for order, or we the mega orderers, whereby people in a bottom-up way will want the government to change the priorities. And if it comes a combination of bottom-up with finding a leader in a top-down way, it might actually work.
So I don't believe there's ever really been a period where international law was fully respected by everybody, and I think partly that's because I spent a lot of time looking at the Middle East, which seems to be a particular area of exception. But it's never, I think sometimes we're thinking too much as though all of the time since World War II was great until 2014 and then 2022. I would also say that what Putin is doing is very much the exception rather than the rule, and it's enabled by nuclear weapons. The last time something like this happened was Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. People defended Kuwait. People basically haven't defended Ukraine because of the nuclear threat very broadly. They've supported Ukraine. People don't want to put boots on the ground. I think we will see more countries wanting nuclear weapons for that reason. But most countries are not invading their neighbours. Most countries are trying to find ways to talk and cooperate and trade with one another. And I think it's good to bear that in mind. On the defence spending, I've spent the last 2 days here in RUSI actually debating exactly this point. Many people say that Trump is going to come to the NATO summit asking for 5% of GDP commitments, but that, hey, he'll take 3 to 4%. Don't know what time frame that would be over. But really, there's not fiscal space in Europe unless you do a Germany and change your fiscal rules. And I think that's going to be increasingly tempting. I personally also think that because a lot of the security threats that we face are going to be hybrid threats and relate to societal resilience, spending on social welfare and spending on health can be useful for those things as well. You know, I think that maybe we get into a false dichotomy at the moment between defending ourselves and spending on social priorities. But I think this is basically going to be the dominant issue for pretty much all European politicians over the next decade.
So I think, as you can tell, I like telling stories about places that we've been. We are literally very insular in the UK. We have been lucky not to be occupied, invaded, etc. for millennia or whatever. But get on a flight with Air Baltic, other airlines are available, to the Baltic states and speak to people there who, in their memory, have been occupied. And they are not going to let themselves go back. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Latvian foreign minister. And if you follow her on LinkedIn, her posts are regularly peppered with her on the front line doing training and rolling out barbed wire at the weekend. Now, you know, I actually, that is not just for kind of self promotion. Or you sit next to somebody at dinner in Estonia and they'll show you an app on their phone that shows precisely the 10 square meters that they need to go and defend when the whistle blows. So I think we as the UK should be learning from these countries who, in living memory, have faced this kind of experience. We should be learning from the Finns. We should be learning from the Swedes. And so I think there is a risk that we sit here in London and think everyone else is as crap as we are, put simply. And I don't think that's true. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't get our own house in order. I mean, it was interesting, wasn't it? During the general election in 2024 in the UK, there was a kite flown by, I think it was the Tories, wasn't it, that they might reintroduce some form, possibly maybe, of national service that might involve people having to do something. You know, bloody hell! The kind of the sort of chaos that kicked off as a result of that. So we need to start now, sensitizing, I think, people to the fact that we do live in a different era. You might be called on to do things which involve something other than Instagram. He says, sounding like a dinosaur, but you might have to do that. But we need to start now because we haven't got the sort of recent history that countries where this is taken as kind of part of life have had to suffer. So that's sort of my perspective on that, and generally on kind of where we are in all of this.
Those are great closing thoughts, and I would just say we can learn a lot from Ukraine, not just
Here,
those Baltic states.
Slava
And Jane,
Ukraini.
your thoughts or story?
My last place I travelled was Oman, which is a very beautiful place. It's relatively quiet, less developed than its Gulf neighbours. They don't go for skyscrapers at all. And I was driving or being driven on this road through these mountains, and I saw a huge billboard saying, "Coming soon, Trump Golf Course," because the Omani government has gone into a partnership with a Saudi government company to do a Trump golf course. And I thought, this really is a sign of the times.
But it's not corrupt and it hasn't affected foreign policy at all.
It's transactional. It's transactional. And I guess they think at least it's clear, we know what to do. It's much cheaper than actually hiring all those lobbyists in Washington that the UAE is doing. Golf. And so with my Omani friends, we came up with an idea that the Gulf Cooperation Council could make peace in the world through the Golf Cooperation Council, where everyone can have peace through golf, and then we won't need to spend all this money on defence.
Brilliant. Peace through golf. I didn't think of it, but she tells it much better than me. So I promised earlier a story about market capture, and in a way, this allows me to do a shameless product tie-in, because you thought that this was all just a product tie-in for the podcast, but it is also a product tie-in for the book, Libya and the Global Enduring Disorder. Because I talk a lot about sanctions, market capture, corruption, not so much tariffs. And I think that there is a certain kind of corruption that the Libyans were way ahead of the curve. You know, this idea that the Miss Manners Guide to Correct Kleptocracy was written in Libya. You know, what does a Libyan oligarch get for his cousin's kid on his second birthday party? 2 British Virgin Islands shell companies. So my story is kind of uncovering how the tentacles from there and here are all intermingled, and corruption might not be what you imagined. Before I ran a K Street trade association with very small member companies that you haven't heard of, like ConocoPhillips and Motorola and Pepsi, I thought corruption was the guys go to Equatorial Guinea and they have bags of money and they find the cousin of the ruler or the wife of the minister and they give him the bags of money, and then what they get is the right to drill the oil, right? That was my kind of vision of corruption. But what I experienced is that in our era of enduring disorder, corruption could be market capture. I was tasked on the margins of the UN General Assembly in 2017 by the then Libyan Prime Minister, Fayez al-Sarraj, make me a trade mission of US companies to Libya. I said, I'm honored. Of course we will do this. He then even wrote my association a formal letter saying, we would like the trade mission of the US companies. So I'm thinking, this is great. I'll get the US State Department to play ball, or the Department of Commerce will make an official mission. It would never have occurred to me that my own member companies would not want the trade mission to happen and would sabotage it. But they did. And this is a lesson and a story that I tell in the book. It's a story of market capture, because if you're sitting on the existing wells or the EPSA agreement or the crude sharing agreement, or you have the cell phone number of the central bank governor and you can get your letter of credit paid, and you know that the other companies can't, maybe you don't want a trade mission, because then all the other American companies who don't yet have that level of access, they'll go to Tripoli, they'll meet people. So I think this is what we very much maybe have gotten wrong until this Trump era, is that a lot of what is corruption and the brokenness of our financial systems isn't always about making more money, selling more widgets, bribing the guy to get preferential access. Things are even more complicated in their screw-uppedness. So on that glorious note, I hope you have enjoyed our ordering of the global financial disorder with Tom Keating and Jane Kinnenmont. So, mega orderers, I hope you enjoyed this live event at RUSI. Please follow the link in the show notes, subscribe to our Ordering the Disorder Substack to get more information on Tom Keating's great output about sanctions against Russia, how to seize their central bank assets, and to find out about future live events. We'd love to see you coming along, or we'd love to see you donating by being a member of the paid Substack if you can't make it into London, but you'd like to show that you support these kind of events. They're very expensive to put on, and we really need your support. Also, I did a special YouTube that we're going to put in the show notes, and this YouTube is about Gary Lineker. His recent posts, the controversy about his retweeting a rat emoji in an explainer about Zionism. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, which we're just launching as part of our transition to Evergreen. Woo! We are with Evergreen Podcasts now, and we are going to be bringing you more exciting content. And it is going to be produced, as always, by the one, the only, the mega orderer-in-chief, George McDonough. I am wishing you an orderly week. Next Tuesday, there is an amazing episode. Robert Kaplan, author of Wasteland. Do not miss it. See you then.